Hi everyone, I'm Marcus Voss from AXO, and today I'm going to tell you what types of contracts there are for the creation of software or IT solutions and what significance this has for the definition of our process strategy in the project. We remember, in the video on influencing factors, we already established that there is a whole group of influencing factors that have to do with the contract. Let's start now with a few but essential terms that you should simply know, even as a software engineer. A project agreement from a commercial point of view. What is it? In such an agreement there is a customer. This issued to a supplier an order, namely, to provide a service in the form of the implementation of a software project or the creation of a software solution, and for this service the supplier then receives remuneration. Now we are the ones who build the software solution or implement the software project. That is our view, is that of the supplier for everything that follows. And so back to the important terms. Our service as a supplier is therefore the implementation of the software project. In other words, the project is defined by a specific and delimited service that we as a supplier provide for our customer, possibly with the customer's cooperation. A contract in this context corresponds to a concrete commercial and legally valid agreement between the customer and the supplier for the provision of this service or a part thereof. A project can comprise one or more contracts, for example, one contract per release, but also individual single contracts to the project members involved. From the supplier's point of view, that is from our point of view, the following three things are now associated with each contract. An effort in person days, PD, that we have to invest with our team in order to provide the service or partial service. The costs that we incur in the process, which are both the personnel costs that belong to the effort, as well as any material costs for hardware, software, travel costs, expenses, etc., if applicable. And of course the revenues, that is the remuneration that the customer pays us in return. And of course we make a profit when the revenues are greater than the costs. So much for the commercial basics. For the definition of our approach strategy in the project, it is now important to know the type of contracts on which our project is based. This type results as a combination of three aspects. Aspect 1 is the obligation or debt arising from the contract. What do we actually owe? What is the nature of the service we must provide? The most important distinction in this area is that between work and service. In a contract for work, we owe the customer a defined work, that is a concrete result, a specific scope, or a somehow delimited functioning whole. This is finally accepted by the customer. Only then is the service considered to have been rendered. In a service contract, on the other hand, we, as the name suggests, merely owe a service, that is our actions. What exactly comes out of it is formally irrelevant. So you can see, the requirement is qualitatively higher in a contract for work than in a contract for services. And then, of course, there may be various other contracts associated with our project, for example, purchase, rental or hire purchase or leasing contracts for hardware, software licenses or the use of cloud services, or also, for example, employee leasing contracts, which, as a side note, we tend to reject for sound project management, but also for other reasons. These contracts also exist, but they do not play a role for further consideration here. What is important, however, is aspect number 2. This is the billing method, that is the contractually agreed form in which we bill for our services. Here we distinguish between 2 or 3 forms, depending on how you look at it. The first is the fixed price. As the name suggests, here the customer pays a fixed price for our service, regardless of how much effort we de facto have to invest or had to invest in the end. This is contrasted with the billing of the actual work performed, possibly including the material costs incurred, usually referred to as time and material or T&M. In practice, there are 2 subforms of this. In a maximum price agreement, the customer pays for our service as incurred, but only up to an agreed maximum price. Such an agreement is often also referred to as T&M with a lid. On the other hand, we refer to the case in which the customer pays for our services as they are incurred without any limitation as an indicative price agreement. However, and this is also important to know, the customer usually expects at least implicitly a certain upper limit, because in such a case T&M usually makes and communicates an estimate of the costs without a lid, and the expectation is of course that this estimate will not be arbitrarily overstated with the same notified result. Looking at these 3 variants, opportunities and risks are distributed differently between customer and supplier in terms of what the de facto effort looks like. Again, I'm not going through the table cell by cell, everyone can reread that separately. In summary, however, it can be stated that with fixed price, left column, opportunities and risks are balanced. While the customer always pays the planned price, the supplier can connect the project with higher or lower profitability, depending on how much effort he needs. Even with the target price or T&M without cap, right column, opportunities and risks are balanced. The variability here lies with the customer, because while the supplier always closes with the planned profitability, the customer pays a lower or higher price depending on the supplier's efficiency. The only small imbalance here is that a higher price than expected requires communication at least once. In fact, the opportunities and risks are not balanced in the case of a maximum price agreement, middle column. This agreement favors the customer, because if the supplier is more efficient, he pays a lower price. But if he is less efficient than planned, he must bear the lower profitability himself. In the sense of a fair commercial agreement at eye level, a maximum price agreement should therefore be avoided. And then there is a third relevant aspect. This is that of scope stability. What does our contract say about how fixed or flexible the scope to be implemented is? And as you might expect, we distinguish between two variants. In the case of a fixed scope, the target scope is completely defined at the beginning of the contract and remains stable, except for change requests, CRs, that are explicitly agreed in the contract. In the other case, the target scope is de facto flexible. That means it results contractually agreed iteratively through regular adjustment or reprioritization. And this is, of course, exactly the necessity in an agile project. An agile project with a contractually fixed scope is a contradiction in terms. It is important to note that even agile projects with a flexible scope are usually contracts for work. If agile software development is contractually agreed with a customer, it must still be assumed that it is a contract for work, since the customer expects a certain result, even if the result is not yet 100% defined when the contract is concluded. However, a contract for work also means that the service is not deemed to have been rendered until it has been accepted at the end. Whereas in classic non-agile waterfall projects, the previously created and explicitly accepted technical concept serves as the basis for acceptance. In agile projects, all decisions made during the project term serve as the basis for acceptance. These decisions must therefore be documented in a sustainable manner in order to be able to carry out acceptance at all. The contract type, and thus implicitly the project type via the underlying contracts, results from a combination of the three aspects described: obligation, billing form, and scope stability. And from a commercial point of view, each possible combination entails different risks for the supplier, that is for us. In the picture, this is shown as a three-dimensional space or a cube in it, and with two expressions per aspect. There are 8 parts in the cube, colored from green to yellow, orange to red, depending on the risk. We see a contract for work is riskier than a contract for services. We have already talked about this. The requirements are simply higher in terms of quality. Fixed price is riskier than T&M without a lid, because even if the opportunities and risks in the customer-supplier relationship are balanced, and every fixed price theoretically also has opportunities for fixed price profits, the risk of losses is just higher than with T&M, not least because commercially agreed fixed prices always tend to have to be calculated as tightly as is justifiable due to competition among potential suppliers. And fixed scope is riskier than flexible scope, which is due to the fact that with flexible scope, there can still be further discussion or negotiation in the project, and there is the opportunity to learn. And that brings us to the best practices. What needs to be considered with regard to the different types of contracts and projects? First of all, beware of the combination of work plus fixed scope plus fixed price. A work with a fixed scope at a fixed price carries the highest risk. Here, any change in scope, that is, any form of new requirements, whether explicit or creeping, must be strongly controlled. There must be an explicit change request, CR, process, and that does not necessarily increase efficiency. See the best practice video on scope management. It is also essential to include a risk premium to cover project risks. More on this in the best practice video on project costing. Then, agree on a CR budget. If it has to be a fixed price, at least a CR budget should also be agreed, for example 10 to 15% of the total volume. This budget can then be used to handle changes unbureaucratically, which at least provides a certain amount of freedom for agility and flexibility. And the promise to follow an open book policy with regard to this budget increases the customer's trust and is quite often a minimum prerequisite for him to get involved at all. And finally, earn the customer's trust. The The customer's desire for such a classic work at a fixed price is usually an expression of a need for security and thus possibly also of a lack of trust. It is worthwhile to work on trust in order to come to better forms of handling in the course of time. So in such cases, think explicitly about what can be done to achieve this. The best practice video on stakeholder management provides important tips on this. And in the next video, we'll take another look at one particular type of contract, the agile fixed price. Until then.